Mara Foster had 11 days to make the season's first loan payment, or lose the orchard she and her husband had bought for $200, with $3,000 more in unpaid back taxes stacked against them like a second mortgage nobody would forgive. That same week, a manila folder arrived at their farmhouse with no return address, sent by a retired state pomologist who had been quietly tracking their land for 40 years, and he wasn't finished with it yet. The coffee maker in the Foster Rourke kitchen only worked if you propped its cord against the outlet at a precise 45-degree angle, a small daily negotiation Mara had come to find almost comforting. Every morning at 5:40, she stood at the counter in 2 sweaters, watching steam curl up past a window whose glass had gone slightly wavy with age, and listened to the orchard outside crackle awake. Frost letting go of 300 dead and dying apple trees, one popping branch at a time. It was, she sometimes thought, the sound of a place clearing its throat before it told you something you didn't want to hear. She was 24. Eli was 26. Neither of them had grown up on a farm. She'd studied environmental science for 2 years before the money ran out. He'd worked landscaping crews since he was 17 and had calluses to prove it, but no formal training in anything a bank loan officer would call relevant. They had met at a farmer's market in Portland, bonded over the absurd idea that 2 people with a combined $4,000 in savings could somehow become farmers, and married in her parents' backyard 18 months later with borrowed folding chairs and a cake Eli's sister had made from a box mix. Neither set of parents believed in the orchard plan. Mara's mother had said gently that she hoped they had a backup. Eli's father hadn't said anything at all, which was its own kind of answer, and had repeated that silence, pointedly, every Thanksgiving since. They had found the land, 62 acres in Talus Valley, a quiet agricultural stretch tucked against the foothills of Oregon's Cascade Range, through a county tax auction listing nobody else had bothered to bid on. 300 apple trees, most of them dead or dying, choked with blackberry vines and neglect, the old farmhouse roof caving in on one corner where a maple had come down in a windstorm years before anyone thought to clear it. $200. The auctioneer had almost laughed, reading the number aloud, glancing around the mostly empty room, as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. Mara had raised her hand before Eli could stop her. He told the story afterward, for months, with a mixture of horror and pride, as though he still wasn't sure which reaction was the correct one. In the mudroom, hanging on a bent nail by the back door, was a pair of pruning shears that had belonged to her grandfather, the only person in her family who had ever grown anything on purpose. He'd kept a modest backyard orchard in the Willamette Valley, 4 trees and a strip of raspberry canes, and had let Mara follow him around it every summer of her childhood, naming things for her in a low, patient voice. This is a water sprout. This is a spur. This will fruit in 3 years if we're patient with it. The blade of the shears was nicked in 3 places from 40 years of cutting dead wood, the wooden handle worn smooth and dark, where a thumb had rested 1,000 times. He had died when she was 16, before she understood that the smell of cut apple branches, green and bitter and strangely sweet, was something she'd go looking for the rest of her life. She had packed the shears without really deciding to, the way you pack certain objects on instinct rather than reasoning. They didn't cut anything particularly well anymore. She kept them anyway, and some mornings, standing at the kitchen window, she found her eyes drifting to the nail where they hung, as if checking that they were still there. She still remembered, with a clarity that surprised her, the one afternoon he'd let her make a graft herself. She must have been 11 or 12, standing on an overturned crate to reach the branch, his hand steadying hers while she made the cut. The wood has to want to meet, he told her, in the low, unhurried voice he used for anything that mattered. You can force 2 pieces together, but they won't grow as one unless the cuts are honest. She hadn't understood it then. She would think about that sentence a great deal later, in ways she couldn't have predicted standing on that crate. That morning, staring at the frost-cracked rose through the wavy glass, Mara understood, the way you understand weather changing before the sky admits it, that whatever quiet, grinding normal they had built over the past year was about to end. She just didn't know yet whether it would end in loss, or in something else entirely. The first 90 days on the land had been almost bearable, mostly because neither of them yet understood the scale of what they'd bought. 90 days was still early enough to run on adrenaline and the small, stubborn hope that comes from sheer ignorance. By late that first autumn, 3 seasons before the folder arrived, the ignorance had burned off, and the debt had not. The bank had approved them for an equipment loan of $18,000, secured against machinery they didn't fully own yet, on the strength of a business plan that a loan officer named Nancy Holloway had reviewed with visible skepticism. She'd sat across a laminate desk from them, reading glasses pushed down her nose, and said, not unkindly, that organic apples from 300 dead trees was not what her bank usually called collateral. She approved it anyway, barely, and over the objections of at least one colleague, she admitted later, on a 6-month probation clause meaning one missed payment could trigger the entire loan coming due at once. Mara remembered signing the papers with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the particular vertigo of watching her own signature commit her to something enormous and permanent. By the second spring, 210 of the 300 trees were confirmed dead. Split trunks, root rot, canker disease spreading root to root like gossip through a small town. The remaining 90 were sick in ways the county extension agent couldn't fully explain, their leaves curling early each June, their fruit dropping green and bitter in July, weeks before it should have ripened. Eli spent whole days on his knees in the mud, cutting away blackened wood with a borrowed chainsaw, coming inside at dusk with his hands raw, and his optimism visibly thinner than it had been that morning. Mara kept the books at the kitchen table each night, and the books kept telling her the same unbearable story. They were spending faster than the trees could ever pay them back, if the trees paid them back at all. Some nights, she closed the ledger and simply sat with her hands flat on the cover, not crying, just breathing, the way you might sit with a fever and wait to see whether it broke. Their neighbors were not cruel exactly, but they were honest in the particular way rural communities are honest, bluntly and often at the feed store in front of other people. Walt Prewitt, who ran 300 healthy acres of Golden Delicious 2 properties over, told Eli directly, in line at the register, that the Foster Rourke orchard was a lost cause dressed up as a startup, and that he'd be doing them a favor by buying the land back off them cheap before the bank did it for free. He meant it as help. It didn't feel like help. Eli repeated the comment to Mara that night with a forced, flat laugh that didn't quite land, and she noticed, not for the first time, how much effort it took him now to sound unbothered. Her mother visited that same month, driving up from Salem with a casserole and an expression Mara recognized from childhood as the one reserved for things that were about to be discussed, whether Mara wanted to discuss them or not. They walked the rows together in the thin spring light, her mother pausing at each dead tree as though counting them, and finally said, carefully, that she wasn't trying to talk Mara out of anything, only that she wanted to know there was a plan for what happened if the trees simply didn't come back. Mara didn't have an answer that satisfied either of them. Her mother hugged her hard before driving home, and neither of them mentioned the casserole dish still sitting untouched on the porch, which felt, somehow, like the truest thing said all day. A county extension agent named Ron Castellano had visited twice that same spring, walking the rows with a soil probe and a clipboard, and had told them, on his second visit, with the flat certainty of a man who had seen 100 failing orchards before theirs, that continuing to invest labor into trees showing this level of dieback was, in his professional opinion, throwing good money after bad. He wasn't wrong about the trees he was looking at. He simply hadn't looked closely enough at all of them, and neither yet had Mara or Eli. It was midway through that second spring that the first strange piece of mail arrived. Not the pomologist's folder yet, but a short, formal letter from the County Historical Society, forwarded through 3 different addresses before it found them, asking permission to survey remaining rootstock of possible heritage significance on the property. Mara read it twice, confused, half suspecting a mistake or a mass mailing sent to every rural parcel in the valley. She set it on the kitchen table under a stack of unpaid invoices, where it sat for 6 weeks doing absolutely nothing to explain itself. She didn't know yet that the letter was the first thread of something much larger already moving, quietly, in the background of their crisis. Something that had nothing to do with them personally, and everything to do with a single tree in the northeast corner of the orchard that none of the extension agents had bothered to examine closely, because it looked, at a glance, exactly like all the others they'd already written off as dying. The bank's 6-month probation clause came due at the worst possible moment, 3 days after Eli's truck transmission failed on the highway shoulder outside town, in the same week, their propane tank ran dry. Mara sat at the kitchen table doing arithmetic that refused to work out no matter how many times she rearranged it, the numbers on the page as stubborn and unmovable as the frozen ground outside. They were short by $4,100. Nancy Holloway, not unsympathetic, but bound by policy, gave them 30 days before the loan would be called in full, and suggested gently that they consider whether continuing made financial sense. It was Eli who suggested selling off 2 tractors worth of scrap metal from an old equipment shed behind the barn. Not a solution, just a stopgap, a way to buy 2 more weeks. It was while clearing that shed, moving decades of rusted farm debris into the truck bed under a gray, low sky that threatened rain all afternoon and never delivered it, that he found a second letter, this one older, water-stained, tucked behind a support beam where it had apparently sat for years, addressed not to them, but to the orchard's previous owner, a man named John Hale, who had died 11 years before they'd ever heard of the property. The letter was signed by a man named Dr. Alden Roos, retired staff pomologist for the State Agricultural Extension Service. It referenced, in dry academic language, the surviving specimen believed to be a remnant of Harmon's nonpareil, cultivated in this valley between 1890 and approximately 1938, and considered functionally extinct in commercial nursery stock since at least 1960. The letter asked John Hale's permission to take grafting cuttings. It was dated 19 years earlier. There was no indication it had ever been answered. Eli carried it into the kitchen, still smelling of rust and diesel, and set it in front of Mara without a word, watching her face while she read it. Neither of them had ever heard of Harmon's nonpareil. But that night, for the first time in months, Mara found herself walking the rows with a flashlight after dark, not looking for anything in particular, just looking. At bark, at bud shape, at the particular curl of dead leaves still clinging to one especially gnarled tree in the northeast corner. A tree that had, against everything the extension agents had told them, produced a small, strange, oddly late crop of fruit the previous November. Fruit none of them had bothered to taste because by then they were too exhausted to care about anything that wasn't due immediately. But what she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that the folder now sitting unopened in their mailbox, sent by that same Dr. Ruess, 40 years into a private obsession nobody had asked him to keep, contained something that would either save the orchard or make its loss unbearable in an entirely new way. The folder, when Mara finally opened it at the kitchen table 3 days later, contained photographs, decades old, black and white, curling at the corners, of a single apple tree, photographed from 4 angles with handwritten measurements in the margins. Trunk diameter, graft union height, bud density per limb. Beneath the photographs was a typed letter, dated that same week, explaining that Dr. Roos had been informed by the County Historical Society of the recent property survey request, had recognized the parcel number immediately from his own decades-old research notes, and was writing to ask, formally, almost apologetically, whether the Foster Rourke orchard still contained the tree in question. He didn't say what the tree was worth. He didn't say what it would mean if it had survived. He asked only, with the careful restraint of a man who had been disappointed by this exact hope before, whether they might allow him to visit before the ground froze again. Mara looked up Harmon's nonpareil that night on a laptop balanced on her knees, and found almost nothing. A single paragraph in a digitized 1931 nursery catalog, a passing mention in a state agricultural bulletin from 1947, noting its resistance to a root disease that had otherwise devastated the region, and nothing at all after 1960, as though the variety had simply stopped being mentioned because there was nothing left to mention. It was a strange feeling, she thought, to hold in your hands something the internet itself didn't fully believe existed. Eli wanted to call immediately. Mara, strangely, wanted to wait a day, not out of caution, but because some instinct told her that whatever this letter was circling deserved to be approached carefully, the way you'd approach something wild that might startle and run if you moved too fast. She spent that evening rereading the old, water-stained letter to John Hale, trying to picture the man who had received it 19 years earlier and, for reasons she'd never know, had never written back. Dr. Ruess arrived the following Thursday morning in a station wagon that looked older than he was, carrying a canvas satchel of tools that could have belonged in a museum, a hand lens, a pocket knife with a bone handle, a leather-bound notebook filled with 60 years of small, cramped handwriting. He was 78 years old and walked the frozen rows with the unhurried attention of a man visiting a grave he'd been afraid he'd never find. He paused twice along the way, at trees Mara and Eli had already written off, and made small notations in his notebook without comment. When he finally reached the gnarled tree in the northeast corner, the one that had dropped its strange, late fruit the previous November, he stood in front of it for nearly a full minute without speaking, one gloved hand resting flat against the bark, the way you might check a pulse. "This is it," he said finally, quietly, more to the tree than to them. "This is Harmon's nonpareil. I thought it was gone in 1963. He explained haltingly, standing in the cold with his breath fogging between sentences, that Harmon's nonpareil had been a minor commercial variety a century earlier, a late ripening apple, dense-fleshed, resistant to a particular root disease that had wiped out most competing rootstock in the region during the 1930s, prized briefly for its extraordinary storage life before faster growing. Better marketed varieties pushed it out of every orchard in the state within a single generation. The last confirmed specimen, as far as Dr. Rues's own research had ever determined, had died in a county demonstration orchard sometime in the early 1960s, a loss he still spoke of with an old man's precise, undiminished grief. He had spent decades since then chasing rumors of surviving trees on old, abandoned parcels across 3 counties, following property records the way other men followed sports statistics, writing careful letters to owners who rarely answered and sometimes weren't even alive to receive them. John Hale's orchard had been his last remaining lead. John Hale had died before Dr. Rues ever got an answer, and the trail had gone cold for 19 years until a County Historical Society volunteer cataloging old parcel surveys as a retirement project had happened to mention the name in passing at a meeting Dr. Roos still attended out of habit more than obligation. But he still wouldn't say what the tree was worth. Not yet. He said only that he needed to confirm the graft was genuine, that the tree hadn't simply reverted to seedling rootstock over the decades, which happened more often than people wanted to believe, producing fruit that resembled the original in appearance, but carried none of its true genetics. Confirmation would require propagation trials and DNA comparison against archived specimens preserved at the State Agricultural University, and, above all, it would require time. Time was the one thing the bank's 30-day notice had already told them they didn't have. Dr. Roos left that afternoon with 3 careful cuttings wrapped in damp cloth, promising results within 6 weeks. Mara stood at the edge of the orchard, long after his station wagon had disappeared down the gravel road, one hand resting on the trunk of the strange, gnarled, nearly dead tree that might be worth everything or nothing, and felt, for the first time in over a year, something that wasn't quite hope, but was at least its close, cautious relative. Eli came and stood beside her without speaking, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, which was its own kind of conversation. What she didn't yet understand was that even if the tree proved genuine, even if Dr. Roos's decades-long search finally had its answer, the discovery would not simply hand them a solution. It would hand them a much harder problem, wrapped in far better paper. The confirmation came 39 days later, 4 days before the bank's extended deadline, in a phone call that made Dr. Roos's normally measured voice crack slightly with something like joy. The DNA comparison had matched archived tissue samples from a specimen collected in 1958. The tree was genuine. It was, as far as anyone could determine, the last confirmed living specimen of Harmon's nonpareil in existence. It should have felt like winning. Instead, it felt like being handed a second, more complicated job on top of the one that was already failing them. Dr. Rues explained, gently but firmly, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of tea he'd barely touched, that a single surviving tree, no matter how historically significant, was not an orchard and was certainly not a business. Commercial revival of a lost variety required propagation, grafting scion wood onto new rootstock, growing out trial trees for years before any of them produced fruit reliably, and building relationships with nurseries and specialty distributors who had never heard of Harmon's nonpareil and had no particular reason to believe a name from 1930 would sell in a modern market, crowded with Honeycrisp and Cosmic Crisp and a dozen trademarked newcomers with marketing budgets behind them. There was no shortcut. There was, if anything, more work ahead than there had been before the letter ever arrived. Worse, The bank did not care about heirloom apple genetics. Nancy Holloway, reviewing their loan file with the same careful skepticism as before, told them plainly over the phone that a rare tree with no commercial track record was not collateral either, and that the 30-day deadline still stood regardless of how remarkable their discovery was. They needed cash now, not a historic apple variety that wouldn't produce a sellable harvest for 3 more years at the earliest. It was Mara who suggested the idea that ultimately bought them time, a small crowdfunding campaign built not around the abstract promise of organic farming, but around the specific, strange, almost cinematic story of a nearly extinct apple surviving alone in a dying orchard. She wrote the campaign copy at 2 a.m. at the kitchen table under the same wavy glassed window, using her grandfather's shears as the campaign's small featured photograph, resting against the bark of the surviving tree, blade nicked, handle worn smooth. She didn't fully understand yet why that image mattered so much to her. She only knew it felt true, in a way that careful business language never had. The campaign raised $6,300 in 11 days, enough to cover the immediate loan shortfall, but not nearly enough to fund 3 years of propagation work, new fencing, disease treatment for the surviving rootstock, or the specialized cold storage equipment Dr. Roos insisted they'd eventually need to properly preserve harvested fruit. Mara and Eli were no longer facing the loss of the orchard outright. They were facing something slower and, in its own way, harder. Years of underfunded, uncertain labor, with no guarantee the variety would even take, to grafting the way Dr. Roos hoped it would. Eli, 3 weeks into the grafting process, Dr. Roos had taught them by hand, cutting sign wood at a precise slant, binding it to new rootstock with grafting tape, waiting for a callus to form that might or might not ever take. Lost their first 11 graft attempts to a late frost none of the county's long-range forecasts had predicted. He sat on an overturned bucket in the orchard afterward, not speaking, staring at 11 small dead grafts wrapped in tape that had failed for reasons partly beyond anyone's control. Mara found him there an hour later, the light going gray, and sat down on the cold ground beside him without saying anything useful, because there wasn't anything useful to say. It was the closest either of them came to quitting. But what neither of them yet knew was that the failed grafts, discouraging as they were, would teach them something about timing and technique that the next attempt, the one that mattered, would depend on completely. Dr. Roos, when he heard about the 11 failed grafts, didn't offer sympathy so much as a revised method. Graft later in the season, after the last historical frost date for the valley, rather than the calendar date most guides recommended, and use a whip and tongue graft, instead of the simpler cleft graft Eli had learned from an online video. It meant waiting 6 more weeks. It meant 6 more weeks of uncertainty stacked on top of everything already uncertain, 6 more weeks of watching the calendar and the bank statement with equal dread. But it also meant that when they finally tried again in early June, working together this time, Mara holding the rootstock steady while Eli made each cut, 17 of 20 new grafts took successfully. Small green shoots emerging from the graft unions within 3 weeks, proof that Harmon's nonpareil could, in fact, be propagated at scale, given the right patience and the right hands. That same summer, a second obstacle arrived in a different form entirely. A representative from a large regional grocery distributor, a polished young man named Trent Okafor, who drove up in a rental car and spoke in the confident, friendly shorthand of someone used to closing deals quickly. Hearing about the crowdfunding campaign's modest local media coverage and offering to buy exclusive rights to the Harmon's nonpareil name and all future harvests for a flat sum of $12,000, enough to solve every immediate financial problem the orchard had permanently in a single signature. It was tempting in a way that frightened Mara more than the debt itself had. Eli, exhausted and increasingly desperate, wanted to consider it seriously, and the two of them argued about it quietly in the kitchen for most of one night, the first real argument they'd had since buying the land. "It's $12,000 we don't have to earn," Eli said that night, more exhausted than convinced, turning Trent Okafor's business card over in his fingers as though it might explain itself further on the back. "We could stop being afraid of the mail for 1 season, Mara. Just 1. And in 5 years, it's a sticker on a supermarket shelf," Mara said, "grown by 3 different companies in 3 different states, and nobody ever knows there was one tree behind a shed that survived on its own for 60 years. She wasn't entirely sure she believed her own certainty. She only knew that saying it out loud made something in her chest unclench slightly, and that scared her more than the debt did, because it meant she had already decided. Dr. Ruiz, when they finally called him, was uncharacteristically blunt. "Sign that contract," he said, and Harmon's nonpareil becomes a mass-produced commodity apple within 5 years, indistinguishable from a dozen other supermarket varieties, its actual rarity and history erased by exactly the kind of volume production that had pushed it out of existence the first time around. He reminded them quietly that he had spent 40 years looking for one surviving tree so it wouldn't simply become inventory again. They turned the offer down. It cost them the $12,000 they badly needed. It also, they both privately worried, might have cost them the only realistic path out of the debt they were still drowning in. And for weeks afterward, Mara found herself replaying the decision, wondering whether principle had simply been a more expensive word for stubbornness. The 2 remaining years of propagation work were not dramatic so much as relentless. Eli learned slowly to read the surviving mother tree's bud patterns well enough to time each season's grafting, almost by instinct. Keeping a notebook of his own now, in handwriting that had started to look, Mara noticed with a small ache, faintly like her grandfather's. Mara built relationships, one careful phone call at a time, with 3 small specialty nurseries, and eventually, with a handful of high-end restaurants in Portland, willing to pay a premium for a genuinely rare, well-documented heirloom fruit with a story attached to it. A story she had first learned to tell in that 2 a.m. crowdfunding copy, and had been refining patiently ever since, one rejected pitch and one small yes at a time. The first 11 restaurants she called said no, most of them politely, a few of them not bothering to call back at all. The 12th was a small tasting menu restaurant near the Willamette River, whose chef, a soft-spoken woman named Laura Jenkins, agreed to try a single crate purely out of curiosity about the variety's history. Laura served the apples that same week in a simple dessert course, thinly sliced and barely sweetened, and called Mara afterward to say that 4 separate tables had asked what the apple was called. It wasn't a large order. It was, Mara realized only weeks later, the first domino in a much longer line of them. There were moments, particularly during the second winter, when the work felt less like transformation and more like simple survival, stretched thin over years. Eli's hands, by the second autumn, had developed a permanent roughness that no amount of lotion softened. And Mara caught herself, more than once, staring at her grandfather's shears, hanging on their nail by the door, and wondering whether he would recognize the person she'd become. Steadier, harder in some ways, but also more patient than she'd ever imagined she could be. She didn't have an answer. She kept working anyway, and slowly noticed that the not knowing bothered her less than it used to. Even Walt Prewitt, passing the property one afternoon and seeing the neat new rows of grafted trees behind the old dead ones, slowed his truck long enough to say gruffly that it looked like they might actually pull it off after all. It wasn't an apology. From Walt, it was close to one. By the third autumn, the orchard held 412 grafted Harmon's nonpareil trees across newly cleared and replanted acreage, the original mother tree still standing in the northeast corner, gnarled and unglamorous, and utterly essential. The first commercial harvest, modest, careful, sold almost entirely through direct relationships Mara had built one conversation at a time, brought in $18,000, their first year in the black since buying the land. It wasn't the moment everything changed, but it was the moment they both finally believed it might, and they celebrated that night with a bottle of cheap wine and a frozen pizza, laughing until it turned, briefly, unexpectedly, into tears. What came after wasn't a single dramatic turn, but a slow, compounding shift that neither of them fully registered until they looked back at it from a distance. A food writer from a regional magazine, drawn by the story of a nearly extinct apple surviving alone in a $200 orchard, wrote a feature that other outlets picked up over the following months. A small specialty nursery began licensing certified Harmon's nonpareil rootstock, with royalties flowing back to the Foster Rourke orchard as the recognized origin source. Restaurants that had once politely declined now called asking to be added to a waiting list, and Nancy Holloway, of all people, sent a short handwritten note along with the bank's updated loan terms, saying only that she'd never been happier to be wrong about a piece of collateral. None of it happened overnight. All of it happened because the work itself, unglamorous and exhausting, had simply continued long enough to become something else. 3 autumns after the folder first arrived in their mailbox, an appraiser hired by their now considerably more patient bank spent an entire day walking the property with a clipboard and a tone of professional neutrality that gradually, visibly, gave way to something closer to fascination as he moved row by row through the grafted trees, stopping longest of all at the gnarled mother tree in the northeast corner, asking Dr. Roos's own published notes to be forwarded to him for the file. His final valuation of the 62-acre property, the orchard, the restored farmhouse, the licensed rootstock rights, and the recognized origin status of Harmon's non-Pareo, came in at just over $4 million. Mara read the number twice, the same way she'd once read Dr. Roos's letter twice, not quite trusting either one to be real. Eli, standing behind her, read it a third time out loud, as if hearing it in his own voice might make it settle. Her mother, when Mara called to tell her, was quiet on the line for long enough that Mara asked if she was still there. "I am," her mother said finally. "I'm just trying to remember why I ever thought I knew better." Eli's father, for his part, still didn't say much, but he drove up 2 weekends later, unannounced, and spent an entire Saturday helping restring a section of trellis wire without once mentioning the appraisal, which both of them understood by then as its own kind of apology. But standing in the orchard that same afternoon, watching Eli teach a young apprentice named Theo how to make a whip-and-tongue graft using her grandfather's shears, the blade still nicked, the handle still worn smooth, useless for most modern pruning, but somehow exactly right for this one particular task, Mara understood that the number on the appraisal, however extraordinary, wasn't really the point. The point was the tree in the northeast corner, still standing, still gnarled, still there after everything. The point was 2 people who had bought a dying orchard for $200 because nobody else believed it was worth saving, and had spent 3 years learning the hard way that some things worth saving simply take longer to prove themselves than anyone is comfortable waiting. She hung the shears back on their bent nail by the door that evening, the way she had 100 times before. For the first time since her grandfather died, it didn't feel like keeping something. It felt like passing something on,